houses that I talked to about.
Fair.
Before I start the meeting, I'm just going to take a straw poll or something. People think they can see this better if we turn most of these lights up here off.
Yes.
I'll turn it off once we start. I'll turn it off.
Okay, Mark is going to do it. Okay. This planning commission work session is in order, and before Mark gives his introduction, I'll give an introduction to the introduction. All or most of you, I'm sure, got notices or saw notices of this meeting. And I would remind you that it says that this is going to be a presentation of orientation to this report. It doesn't include questions from the public. There will be at least one other meeting in the future when that will be part of the program. Dr. Allen has graciously said that after he gets done with his presentation and after the commission has asked whatever questions we need to, that he would be willing to answer questions from other people here. And I would ask you not to make that an occasion to preface your question with what you have to say yourself on the subject. There will be a time for that, but this evening isn't going to be it. Mark?
Thank you. So this is a long-awaited work session on an updated SAM study. You'll recall that our dune grading program relies on two studies that were produced between 17 and 20 years ago. There's broad feeling at council level and at this commission, and stated explicitly in at least one of those documents that those documents need updating. We contracted with Dr. Allen to produce the update. He's going to do the presentation tonight. A couple of procedural notes in addition to what you said, Mr. Chair. This is kind of a two-step process. This is the science part of it. The intent here is to follow that up with a policy element that would be the kind of regulatory document. That would be the part you would actually adopt into the policies of the comprehensive plan, into the zoning ordinance that gives out the standards and procedures for evaluating dune grading proposals. That part isn't done yet, actually isn't started yet. It needs to be based on this document. So I expect that sometime, and now I'm guessing, let's say this fall or early winter, we'll be re-adjourning to look at both of these documents together. So the policy decisions haven't been made yet. Actually, no decisions have been made yet. I'm not asking you to adopt anything tonight, but as soon as I wanted to make sure you guys were apprised of where the status of this was, since many of you have asked about it, as soon as a draft document was available. So that's where we are tonight. I also add that allowing people in the audience to ask questions is certainly not a problem. People in the audience should know that by asking a question here, you're not establishing a record, you're not presenting evidence, you're not becoming a party. If you want to do any of those more legalistic things, it'll be at another planning commission meeting where there's actually a hearing scheduled. So if we get to the point where we're taking questions, that's great, but that does not, it's not the same as testimony, it's not the same as testifying in the planning commission hearing, either orally or in writing. It really is just as simple as it sounds, asking questions. With that, I'd introduce Dr. Allen.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Do we want to turn the lights on?
Lights.
I'm going to stand up. It's easy for me to talk and control things if I am standing. So first up, thank you very much for inviting me along today. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you all about the work we have been doing, basically looking at trying to understand the coastal geology, geomorphology of the Canada Beach South. And I should preface this is that the work that I'm presenting here is really based on some of which is very original work, some of which is, a lot of it actually is based on previous scientific studies that have been done by researchers at Oregon State University, particularly Paul Komar and his students, some recent work by Peter Ruggiero and others, as well as work that we've been doing internally within our own agency, and reflects many years of understanding and insights into the coastal geology and geomorphology of the Oregon coast.
Yeah, that's something you seem to have a very strong speaking voice, but having sat in the public area sometimes at these meetings for the city council, sometimes if anybody is having trouble hearing, wave your hand and I'll wave mine at him.
He's very good.
Sounds good. All right, I'll take you through the objectives of the overall study. As Mark indicated, really the focus here is to present the information behind the science background report. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to essentially skim through the outline of the report itself, focusing on the actual physical processes that we know drive coastal geology and geomorphology in Oregon. I'll talk a lot about changes in terms of sediment budgets, particularly where sand is coming from, where it's going, and we'll actually try to put some numbers on the volumes of sand that's being moved around within the Cannon Beach Cell. Focus a little bit on the historical changes that have been taking place, as well as more recent, more established known changes derived from airborne LiDAR, which is using a laser altimetry system to map the ground surface elevation at very precise details. So we base a lot of our volume calculations on that newer technology. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the historical changes with respect to introduction of European beach grass specifically, and what it's meant to with respect to the coastal geology, geomorphology of the Oregon coast. And then talk a little bit about dune management at the end. So phase 2, as Mark alluded to, is going to be later on once the science report is finalised. And obviously, I look forward to hearing comments from the Planning Commission with respect to any thoughts or concerns or additions that you might have with respect to the science report. So what do we mean by littoral cell? Well, a littoral cell is basically a headland-bounded stretch of coast or shoreline. In this case here, this is an oblique shot of the Cannon Beach Cell, taken overlooking Cape Falcon in the far south, looking north towards Tillamook Head. So that is the littoral cell itself. It's a headland-bounded stretch of shore. And within this primary littoral cell, there are these, what we call subcells. So at the very south end there, those of you familiar with Falcon Cove, absolute spectacular bit of shoreline, one of the best, most significant cobble beaches, in my mind, on the Oregon coast. Very dramatic area, undergoing very significant coastal change. To the north of that's Arch Cape, and then you get up into Hug Point, Arcadia Beach, and in the far north you have obviously the Cannon Beach area, and right up against Tillamook Head is obviously the area that is of greatest concern with respect to sand accumulation. So it's about 14 miles long. Within this Pocket Beach littoral cell, really in terms of sediment that's on the beach itself and under the water, what you see is what you've got. There aren't any real significant sediment sources to this system at this point in time. Significant sediment sources would be things like a major river, so the Columbia River or something like that, actually actively carrying large volumes of sand to the coast. There's nothing like that. Even within the Cola Creek itself, I mean, it certainly carries material down, but probably a large volume of that is predominantly silts that aren't really beach-forming material. And so those sediments tend to be removed from the system and taken offshore into deeper water. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but being a headland-bounded cell, the current state of knowledge is that because these headlands extend into deeper water, it is unlikely for sand to actually be moving from south to north around Cape Falcon, or similarly from north to south around Tillamook Head. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with respect to some of the science that actually can at least attest to the fact that we think that this system is a closed system. So really the only major sources of sediment for the system is coming from active erosion of the bluffs themselves, any rock falls that have taken place. So for example, Cape Falcon, there's been some recent landsliding that's taken place there over the last several years. Certainly that can contribute sediment to that littoral system. A lot of that's going to be coarser material that's tending to supply primarily the Falcon Cove area. And then whatever erosion that may be taking place along the bluffs to the north, up in the Hug Point area, all the way up to Tolobana Park, and those areas. So really, very limited sediment inputs into the system. So that's why I said what you see is what you've got. The basic geology of the cell is really in the far north. We have a series of late Pleistocene, Holocene colluvial deposits. This is up off Tillamook Head in the far distance there. These sediments that are up there are actively supplying cobbles and boulders, forming the very prominent boulder beach around Tillamook Head there. As you come south into the Cannon Beach cell, we're looking at more coastal terrace deposits. These are products of sediments that were derived from more of an ancient Kola Creek system, as well as sediments that are even older than that from material that was laid out in the tertiary period that are on the order of, Miocene period, on the order of 15 to 20 million years old. These are very fine-grained sediments, silts and mudstones and things like that. At the far south end, we have a slightly more complicated geology with outcropping basalts there. This is the area that's in a sort of a darker brown there, as well as a lot of colluvial deposits that are actually derived from ancient landslides that actually flowed down historically into that Falcon Cove area. And so that's when you walk along the base of Falcon Cove, you'll see this sort of very hodgepodge mixture of angular material mixed in with a lot of silts and some sands and things like that, but highly erodible. And we know from historical accounts in Falcon Cove, this is an area that's undergoing very active erosion. We know that several homes in that area have actually had to be pulled off their foundations and relocated landward because the eroding cliffs were getting too close to the properties in question. So the geomorphology can be sort of broken up into really four discrete types of coastal features. In the far north, there's predominantly cliffs. This is around Tillamook Head there. A small section of the shore is what we call duneback. That's primarily at the Chapman Point area north of Kola Creek, making up about 5% of the shore. And as you progress southward, down towards Tolobana, into Acadia Beach, then a large chunk of the shore there is made up of what we call bluffback beaches. These are obviously bluffs ranging in height from several meters, so a few tens of feet, up to 30 to 40 feet elevation, or height, I should say. And then at the very far end, I've talked a little bit about Falcon Cove. We have these, what we call a composite beach system, which is a cobble beach that's fronted by a fine sand beach where it's able to dissipate a lot of that energy below water. So that's the basic geomorphology of the coastal geomorphology of the Cannon Beach cell. So we know from many studies around the world that obviously beaches respond in a variety of different ways at very short to large spatial scales, as well as short to long-term temporal scales. Obviously, when you go to the beach on a day like today, the types of changes you're seeing there are the product of localized spring waves that are occurring right now. The beaches are actually in transition from the previous winter, coming into this upcoming summer system, so we start to see sand migrating back onto the beaches. That's the typical seasonal pattern. Build up of sand in the summer, loss of sand in the winter season. Obviously, when you start to look at longer term changes, so we're talking about seasons to interannual variability, so over multiple years, then the changes that we're experiencing are a product of the intensity of the storm systems that propagate across the North Pacific and impact our coastline, as well as fluctuations in ocean sea levels that may be taking place as well. So that can drive the types of variability that we see from season to season over many years. Periodically, we experience major El Nino events. They can also sort of compound or enhance the physical processes that are taking place and result in more movement of sand either offshore or along the beach to other locations. And I'll come back to that in a little bit more in more detail in due course. We know from studies of what we call the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that there's a strong relationship between the occurrence of El Niños and warm and cold phases of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which fluctuates on about a 20 to 30 year cycle. The most recent cycle is a warm phase that started in about 1976. Really has extended through until probably early 2000. And during that warm phase, we had more persistent El Nino conditions, which results in more sediment transport than we would normally otherwise expect to see. Our current phase right now, we are in what we call a cold phase, dominated by what we call La Nina conditions, which tends to result in a reversal in sediment transport processes, assuming that we get the right types of conditions to follow those sort of patterns. So we see these interannual variations of El Niños and 20 to 30 year cycles of much longer climate impacts. And then obviously when we start talking about really long-term changes, these are obviously over many decades, changes that are taking place at these timescales are related to obviously things like climate change, particularly in terms of impacting sea level rise specifically, but potentially also affecting patterns of storminess, intensity, and so on. Longer term changes may be also subject to things like the Cascadia Subduction Zone. We know that in 1700 we experienced a major great earthquake, a magnitude 9, along the entire fault zone. Associated with that, with the incoming tsunami that obviously would have inundated, we know from geologic records that's been done by colleagues of mine up in Ocola Creek here. We can actually track its progression up the Ocola Creek, so we know its extent here. But associated with that is an actual lowering of the coastline by several feet. And when you do that, you actually effectively, it's like raising sea level instantaneously, and you're essentially triggering a whole new phase of coastal evolution as part of that process. So that's another factor that may actually start to sort of complicate pictures over much, much longer timescales. So this is really a conceptual view of what we mean by a sediment budget. And basically, a sediment budget is looking at the credits and the debits of sediment exchange within a defined system. And this is an example. This is an oblique view looking along Netart's Spit there, and the Netart's littoral cell, Happy Camp, just in the bottom of the picture there, looking into Netart's estuary. So essentially if we focus on just the coastal portion, we know that sand is moving along the shoreline in response to variations in wave approach angles, as well as the product of variations in storminess that may actually erode the back of the dunes there that may be supplying sediment. So the little yellow arrow in the middle of Netart's Spit there pointing offshore is an example where sand is actually being eroded from the dunes and supplying the littoral system, which is within the breaker zone within that dynamic area of sand exchange. There's also a lot of sand that may be exchanged across the surf zone as a result of again, variations in seasons with respect to storminess, and I referred to that just previously with respect to the fact that we're now heading into summertime. Our beaches are actually actively grading. When we go back into winter later this year, our beaches get scoured down, that sand gets taken offshore. So there's this on-offshore exchange that's taking place, as well as this alongshore movement of sand as well. And then obviously we can lose sediments offshore. We can get, periodically, we get very extreme events that may result in more scour, more enhanced scour. More of that sand may be transported offshore, some of that may be lost to deeper water. A good example of this was probably the 1998-99 winter. Was really one of the most extreme winters in almost 40 years of coastal observations, resulting in the equivalent of about 5 100-year storms taking place between February and March of 1999. And really it caused very extensive change up and down the Oregon coast. Interestingly, the impacts in the Cannon Beach cell were actually a lot more muted, which was rather surprising to see. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So obviously sediment can be coming in from terrigenous sources, so this is just obviously landsliding, creeks that may be carrying sediment into the estuary itself. And I should point out that in this example, the estuary can be actually a sink for sediment, actually absorbing, taking in sand that's being transported in by the tidal cycle. And actually over the long term, estuaries will slowly fill in and eventually stabilize and transition to more wetland type environments when one starts to think about timescales of decades to hundreds of years. So this is kind of a summary of in terms of sediment sources and losses and sinks within the Cannon Beach cell. And some of this I've already touched on. Obviously at the south end, there's been landsliding, there are rock falls that take place at various high bluff points. There's eroding cliffs along Cape Falcon and up through Arch Cape, all the way up into southern part of Tolovana there. We obviously have a lot of alongshore sediment transport taking place. We have some losses of sediment offshore. We don't know how much that is. But certainly during, again, those very extreme storms, we may lose some portion of our sediment budget offshore. And it's unlikely that those sediments would probably return to the system in those very, very extreme events. I pointed out that obviously you can see as you go further north, there appears to be a larger northward directed transport relative to the southward directed movement. And that's just based on some observations from recent work that's been done by scientists at Oregon State University. Looking longer term, one of the big unknowns is whether this type of current pattern of more northward directed longshore transport is going to persist. That's something we just don't have a good answer for at this point in time.
And you see that as being mainly the result of a lot of that sand getting impounded in the dunes.
The northward, no. So the northward directed transport is I'm focusing more on the actual processes themselves that are driving the movement. So your question about sand being trapped within the dunes, that's why at the very top there I have wind transport to dunes, and I put it in parentheses temporary sink. So yeah, sand can actually get locked up in the dunes there for a period of time, and obviously when you get an extreme storm coupled with high water levels, it's able to erode into those dunes there. It then reactivates and removes that sand and redistributes it within the system again. So it's a temporary sink that's available for nature when it wants it, effectively. Does that answer your question? So where does all our sand come from? Well, I figured probably the best way to start this is go back 18,000 years and then come to the present from there. Maybe this can sort of summarize in general what the approach is. So obviously 18,000 years ago, sea level was about 400 feet lower than it is today at the peak of the last glaciation. And offshore here, excuse me, this dashed red line running right along the edge here is approximately where the coastline would have been 18,000 years ago. The red dashed line further offshore is the Cascadia subduction zone, which is another story. So beginning from around 18,000 years ago through to about 7,000 years ago, sea level glaciation obviously ended. Sea level started rising very rapidly, and you can see that by 9,000 years ago, you've got that dashed line there. Sea level was rising at about 8 millimeters per year over that time period. So at around 9,000 years ago, sea level would have been pretty much close to where that black dashed line is. So very close to our coastline. So really, as was transitioning over this period of time here, we were probably seeing a lot of sand moving up and down this coastline, this older ancient Oregon coastline. And it's unlikely that, unlike today, where we have these prominent headlands that effectively break up our coastline and really minimizes the amount of sand that can move between these littoral cells, sand would have been able to freely move up and down the coast. At around 5,000 years ago, our coastline that we see today has started to effectively develop. And at that point in time, sea level slowed dramatically and is currently reduced to around 1.5 millimeters per year. And going forward right now, I mean, the projections are based on satellite altimetry and things like that. It looks like it's bumped up a little bit for the North Pacific at around 2.2 millimeters per year. And that's obviously a product of climate change related changes that are taking place. So in that period of time when sand was able to freely move, there's some work that was done by Angela Clemens and Paul Komar back in the late 1980s, where they actually did very detailed studies of the mineralogy of the sands along the Oregon coast. And what they were able to do was they were able to define certain key traces from these sediment samples that were taken that really point to the history of our coastline and how it evolved. So, for example, if you look at the pinky red line running from off Cape Blanco in the south there, all the way north up to Tillamook Head, you'll see it basically progressively decreases to zero by the time it reaches Tillamook Head. These are pink garnets, which are originally derived from the Klamath Mountains in northern California. And so we know from this that sand was obviously being transported from northern California up along our coastline, and as sea level approached present-day levels, was being driven onshore onto our beaches, where it eventually became trapped and formed the beaches that we know of today. You see a very similar pattern with hypersthene, which again decreases northward up to Tillamook Head. As you go onto the north side of Tillamook Head, it increases dramatically. That hypersthene on north of Tillamook Head is directly correlated with sediments that are coming out of the Columbia River. We know that based on this mineralogical analysis, at least this is the hypothesis, that Tillamook Head probably forms an effective barrier against sediment transport from sediments coming out of the Columbia River. In fact, a lot of the modeling work that's been done over the last decade as part of the Southwest Washington Coastal Erosion Study, which is one of the most comprehensive investigations undertaken of the Southwest Washington coastline, really demonstrates that sand in that cell is being driven primarily northward up towards the Washington coastline. And really, and so effectively, Tillamook Head forms a natural barrier against any sediments that possibly would come out of the Columbia River. The browner orgites, you can see obviously are very prevalent up in Tillamook County and in southern Clatsop County, including Cannon Beach. These are sediments that are locally derived from erosion of our hills and our rocks along this part of the coastline. And so that's where those sediments are actively coming from. So Clemens and Komar basically argued based on these data that these littoral cells really form very effective barriers for sediment transport. And really the sediments that we have within these systems, unless there are large river systems feeding into them, are effectively fairly much closed to any major sediment inputs from sources other than erosion of coastal bluffs and so on. There have been some recent studies looking at historical shoreline changes. Peter Ruggiero, myself and colleagues did an investigation for the US Geological Survey a few years ago using a variety of historical information. These are National Ocean Service, what we call topographic T-sheets. These are essentially maps that were drawn by surveyors in the 1920s, where they literally went out along the coastline and they mapped the high water rack line. And they did it in late summer. They used old plane tabling techniques, and they literally mapped that entire shoreline along all our beaches. And so that provides us with a proxy of the position of the shoreline at the time. There are problems with how one goes about interpreting that, because today we use datum-based techniques for looking at shoreline positions, and there are issues when you're comparing with these different types of data. Ruggiero and others figured out a way to standardize it, to eventually come up with essentially long and short-term rates of erosion for different areas along the Oregon coast. So the left graphic, so this graphic here just simply shows you a whole series of shoreline positions from the 1920s, which are in purple, a little hard to see, but you can see up here north of Colla Creek, the shoreline would have actually extended right through the Breakers Point condos here and extended all the way as well as seaward of the existing line of high dunes that are present there today. Over time, we've seen significant progradation. Sand has built up, the shoreline has advanced seaward, and by 2015, we can see in yellow here, that's the position of the beach at that point in time. I should point out also the black here is the position in winter, as of late winter 2016, which is here. And so it gives you a sense of what the seasonal variability is between summer and winter conditions on the Oregon coast. It turns out that that seasonal exchange for the shoreline is about 30 meters, so about 100 feet between summer and winter conditions. That's how much it builds out in the summertime and then erodes back in the wintertime, on average. Obviously, when we get extreme years like El Niños, those changes can be amplified quite substantially. Over the long term, Ruggiero and others, using these data from the 1920s up to the present, concluded that really there's no real long-term evidence there's no significant trend of erosion or accretion taking place, with the exception that the black line here shows accretion taking place predominantly north of about Colibana, and that's obviously borne out in some of the more recent analyses that I'll show in a little bit. The grey shading here is a measure of uncertainty based on uncertainty in the types of data that's been used here, the shoreline approaches, particularly the historical data. The graphic on the right is the short-term rate of change, which is from the 1960s, specifically 1967 up through 2002. And because we have a lot more confidence in the quality of the data from 67 through 2002, that error band is significantly reduced. And now we can sort of see the patterns that are taking place along the coastline. So obviously, not unexpectedly, Arch Cape has been experiencing average rates of erosion of around 2 meters per year, so about 6 feet per year. And then as you travel progressively northward, not a lot of change taking place along midway through the Cannon Beach South, so around that Colibana area, based on these data. And then immediately north of Acola Creek there, you see a very dramatic accretion of sand at about 2 meters per year, so the reverse, about 6 feet, plus 6 feet per year north of Acola Creek. So that's the general pattern based on these historical changes. So we can sort of summarize this in a conceptual graphic like this. In the very far south at Falcon Cove, the broader pattern is one of erosion with a lot of variability taking place. And that system is obviously what we call undernourished. There's no significant sediment that's supplying it to really compensate for the patterns that are taking place down there. The reverse obviously takes place in the very far north, up by north of Akola Creek there. The overall pattern is one of more accretion, with again lots of variation that's taking place as a result of fluctuations in seasons, El Nino, storminess, and things like that. And then obviously somewhere in between is what we consider to be stable, where it's balanced with respect to inputs and outputs. What I focus on now is some of the more recent changes that have been taking place since the late 1990s. And I'm going to touch on a variety of different technologies that are available to us. I should just draw your attention to the table on the upper right there. That really highlights the more recent historical data that we have available to us now, up through survey data that we collected ourselves in March of 2016. Most of the data that we have, 1997, 98, 2002, 2009, which was flown by ourselves, and then most recently the USGS flew airborne LiDAR in late March, April of last year. This is using an airborne platform with a laser, Galileo laser scanning system that basically scans along the coastline, measuring very precisely the topographic elevation of the underlying ground. And the accuracies on a flat ground surface are typically around plus or minus several centimeters. The specs that we have are plus or minus 15. We find that more often than not, it's well within those sort of tolerances. So it's very accurate, and this is actually what I ended up basing a lot of our estimates of the volume changes on, was on the LiDAR, particularly given that we had very high quality LiDAR flown in 2009 by ourselves, which is bare earth LiDAR, where vegetation is able to be stripped out completely, and is of a comparable quality to the LiDAR that was flown in 2016 by the USGS. So we base a lot of our volume changes on that particular period there, with respect to some of the changes. So we have other techniques that we can use. We can put survey grade GPS on a backpack. We can put it on a vehicle for measuring shorelines. We've actually implemented, working with Peter's group at Oregon State, putting GPS on jet skis to actually measure bathymetry going off the coastline. We actually did this as part of a FEMA flood mapping exercise a few years ago for all of Clatsop County. So we have available to us some really good technology now that we can draw on to provide more up-to-date assessments of changes that are taking place. Obviously, all of this is tied to GPS control points, as we might see in that GPS base station, where we have monuments established that have very precise coordinates associated with it. So we can get down to accuracies now of a few centimeters for our GPS systems, which obviously more than meets the specs required with respect to measuring changes on beaches. So we, in 2009, 2010, we established a network of GPS transects along all of Clatsop County. As part of this study, we were able to go back and reacquire those same transects and update those data to more up-to-date information, based on surveys we did in late summer of 2015 and late winter of 2016, and then supplemented with LiDAR data as well. We did actually add some additional transects in the presidential dune management area north of Haystack Rock there, as well as a few extra transects in the vicinity of Chapman Point to simply just densify those areas. So the output of that product is a plot like this. You can access this plot as well as other change information for every one of these transects online. If you go to that nvs.nanus.org/beach mapping, All that information is accessible through that website, and you can see changes like this or plots like this for every one of these transects. So main things I wanted to draw your attention to is within this plot there's a darker band shading, and effectively that's what we classify as our normal range of beach variability, which is typically 1 standard deviation about the mean based on all our changes. The sort of lighter shading that bounds that is the maximum and minimum elevation changes, again based on all the data we have available to us. So that gives you a sense of the spatial variability with respect to horizontal exchanges taking place as well as vertical changes. You can see very clearly down on the beach area, we see about 2 meters of fluctuation from season to season across the beach there. So about 6 feet variation down here. And that's fairly standard for the Oregon coast. Other noteworthy items is obviously this dashed line. It's running landward of the grey shading. That's the position of the dune and the characteristics of the dune back in 1997-98 when LiDAR was flown by the USGS then. And so you can clearly see from 1997-98 through to the present, obviously the dunes have actually graded vertically quite significantly, but have also built seaward in front of this particular transect, which is right by Breakers Point there. We can see some new dunal development that's taking place lower down the beach profile. You can also see evidence of an erosion scarp here, the product of that late winter storm that we had in 2016 that caused a little bit of erosion of the dunes up along Chapman Point and actually elsewhere up and down the Oregon coast. So in this example here, we can see, dunes are, the dune crest there reaches around 51 feet, so about 15.5 meters, so fairly substantial. We can speculate when we look at some of the other transects there, based on the shape of morphology. Some of this is probably a product of past grading, scraping activities, where sand was, where part of the dune was lowered, and that sand was pushed seaward. Part of it is also a product of new sediments that may be coming in, that have been coming in from elsewhere within the physical system. We can extrapolate some various features or various statistics or various parameters along the entire cell there. So the upper one compares the slope characteristics along the Cannon Beach cell from Chapman Point in the north all the way down to Falcon Cove. We see that really along a large chunk of the Cannon Beach cell, our beach slopes are very flat, not surprisingly. That's because the sand beaches that you see out here are comprised of primarily medium to fine sand. We know from studies done over many, many years the sand characteristics themselves has a direct bearing on the slope of the beach. As you get down into Falcon Cove, Arch Cape into Falcon Cove, because we start to see more cobble beaches, mixed sand and gravel beaches through to cobble beaches at Falcon Cove, our beaches start to steepen up dramatically. And obviously the most classic example when you get to Falcon Cove there, those large cobble beaches produce a very steep beach face. It turns out these are a little bit more stable beaches relative to the coarser beaches in the south. Coarser beaches tend to be much more receptive responsive to changes in wave conditions. And so they can actually erode and cut back a lot more quickly and dynamically than, say, on a flat dissipated sand beach like you would see here. Obviously, we can see also these are dune heights, crest heights. I put meters on the left, feet on the right there, so not surprisingly, at north of Chapman Point, we have elevations of around 50 to 60 feet, decreasing through the Tolovana State Park area there. We've got much lower elevations, and then obviously bouncing around quite dramatically as you go south there because of the different types of terrain with the old Pleistocene terraces that back there that have variations in slope and heights and so on. The red dots there, just grain size analyses. They were done by Kurt Pearson in a study in the 1980s. Kurt sampled out on the central part of the beach there, and so it produces a product which indicates very fine to medium sand, nothing dramatic from those results relative to anything else that we see along the coast. Similar sort of plot showing now for multiple sites, all north of Akola Creek, and this is really where I just wanted to touch on. If you look at that upper left-hand plot there, you can see the old dunes in 1997-98 that were then eventually graded, pushed seaward. You've got that more uniform flat-topped area now with new dune growth developing seaward of where grading was previously occurred. But it clearly shows you there's been a lot of accumulation of sand north of Akola Creek there. We can densify the data by using LiDAR to do similar sort of comparisons. So here's where we look at changes that are taking place between 1997 and 2009 LiDAR. Here we focus on effectively the dune toe, which is actually a really good proxy for determining the responsiveness to storms. Basically, you have distance along shore on the bottom x-axis here, going from north to south. You have erosion or shoreline change. Red values indicate erosion. Blue or darker values indicate accretion. Zero line here, so these are 10-meter increments, so that's around 30 feet over here, up to 60 feet. So we see basically north of Akola Creek, which is this grey shading here, we've seen progradation on the order of 30 to 60 feet taking place. Again, very consistent with what we've already seen previously. Of interest, as you go south, we see evidence of a lot more erosion taking place south of about Haystack Rock, going all the way down towards Silver Point. Seems to stabilize a little bit more as you get down to the Arch Cape area. Predominantly accretion taking place there, and then when you get down to Falcon Cove, again, I've already talked about this, more evidence to indicate that that area has been undergoing some significant erosion taking place. These sort of fluctuations that you see here are really probably the product of the actual cobble berm itself that's able to fluctuate quite a bit. So it's probably not a terribly good measure of what's going on there. Ideally, in that area, you really want to probably be focusing on the actual toe of the bluff as opposed to the 6-meter contour, which is very close to the crest of the cobble berm itself, which will bounce back and forth a lot. But anyway, I mean, the overall pattern really starts to emerge with this accretion north, erosion in the central portion, and then accretion down by Arch Cape. So what we can start to do now is focus a little bit more on the actual dune changes that have taken place north of Chaplin Point here. So we look at two intervals. These are changes from 1997 to 2009, and then from 2009 through to 2016. And this is just focusing on the back of the beach, above the dune toe, landward to essentially an area that I can define, and I can have confidence that I'm not getting into vegetation or anything like that that might complicate the signature for particularly the earlier LiDAR data taken in 1997. That works fine for the most part in areas where there's grass, but as soon as you start to get into more dense vegetation, then it becomes problematic because that earlier LiDAR is when it was flown, it's not what we call multi-return, it was a single return, so it's basically picking up the surface directly. It may not have actually fully penetrated down through to the actual ground surface itself. So we have to provide some criteria as to where we can constrain the boundaries for ultimately defining sand volumes.
Have you got enough clearly defined returns from the streets to consider them as a baseline?
So yeah, I mean from 2000, so for 1997 data, basically through these areas here, I can have confidence that it's going to be pretty good. It's probably going to err on the side of being maybe a little bit more on the positive side than it actually. In other words, it may actually give there may be larger sand changes than is directly implied from this image because you may be picking up some of that vegetation. So I would consider this as a minimum for this period here. For 2009 to 2016, I have a lot more confidence in the data that I think that's a very good reflection of the changes that are taking place. And for that one, we definitely can, we can ground truth all of these relative to streets and so on, but the 97 data doesn't help us much when we get out into vegetation because it's single return anyway. So we have, we just have to, make a decision whether we're going to use it or not. And when we're going to use it, we need to constrain the areas where we're going to focus the attention on. So 97, 2009, we see obviously a lot of changes taking place down in the Chapman Point area, south end by the Breakers Point condos. The red colours indicate vertical aggradation of around 5 to 6 metres, which is about 16 to 20 feet over that time period. Blue indicates general loss of sand, probably because of dune grading activities that took place here. The lighter tan or lighter yellow colour out here is basically no change or very little accumulation. So it's obviously as you get into the hotter colours, that's giving you a sense of how much aggradation is taking place. But basically the bottom line message from this plot is a lot of the accumulation was taking place at this south end. When you go into the most recent period from 2009-2016, you see that the whole area is now aggrading quite significantly with estimates on the order of 2 to even 4 metres, fewer hotspot changes, primarily around here. We can do the same thing for the presidential dune management area just by south of downtown Cannon Beach there. Main things I wanted to point out, 97 through 2009, this area was actually losing sand. The darker blues up here are almost entirely to do with movement of the Kohler Creek itself, as well as probably some localized storm effects, but primarily the creek's probably driving that. We see generally accretion all the way through here with some movement of sand on the backside, erosion of sand on the backside. Up through 2016, we see a little bit more blue out here, so this area has actually lost a bit of sand while there's gains taking place back at the back of the beach itself. These are obviously areas that, at least in the more the northern extent, there's not a lot of dune vegetation, grass to stabilize it, so there's a lot of active movement of sand back up into the back of the beach. So we can take, all that volume information and we can start to actually put some numbers in terms of what's been taking place within the Cannon Beach South. And so this is a summary for the period 1997 through 2016. We can estimate that the volume based on all our transect data, the volume of sand within the cell is probably around 4 million cubic meters or about 5.4 million cubic yards of sand within the entire littoral cell. In reality, that's probably on the low side because we're excluding sand that's actually out of the near shore in that breaker zone. The littoral zone extends out through to around 50 feet water depth, and so we're ignoring a large chunk of sand that's sitting offshore there. Nonetheless, this is a pretty substantial amount of sand in the cell, and I should point out it's very consistent with the estimates that were made by Chuck Rosenfeld back in '97. I think he estimated 4 million. So given our two reports over 20 years, producing very comparable numbers. we can say that the seasonal sand exchange, just from one period where we compared summer to winter changes from 2015 to 2016, that seasonal exchange is around 2 million cubic meters of sand. So that's how much the beach erodes back after its accumulation at the late summer, on average. Now, clearly that's going to vary from season to season. There'll be some years that'll be more than that, there'll be other years that'll be less than that. 2 million was what we came up with for that period of time. That's probably a pretty reasonable estimate, and I would say it's not unusual relative to what we see elsewhere on the Oregon coast. We know that since 1997, when you sum all the accumulations of sand and losses of sand from each of these discrete compartments, which are broken out into red and green blocks along the entire cell, when you sum all of these changes relative to 1997, we see that the Cannon Beach cell has actually gained sand of about 194,000 meters cube of sand, so about 253,000 cubic yards of sand. In terms of that amount of sand relative to the 4 million and the 2 million exchange, it's a drop in the bucket. I mean, it's the reality of it.
Looks like a big percentage to me. When I read that in the report, I said, where is that much coming from?
It's coming from the beach. It's coming from the beach and the near shore. So that's it's that.
So this is just
Yeah.
coming onto the beach and off of the beach and just going back and forth.
As far as, so if you were to, okay, so this plot here shows the changes between 1997 through 2016. Falcon Cove lost 20,000 cubic yards. Arch Cape gained almost 9,000 cubic yards. Hug Point, Arcadia, Silver Point, Tolobana, this whole area here is eroding. And that would sum out to, what's that? That's about 32, 34, 47, about 50,000 cubic yards through here that's been lost. And then you've got almost over 200,000 accumulation, 300,000 cubic accumulation in the north end. So relative to the amount of sand that's being lost here in these red areas, those losses is not enough to make up for the gains that have taken place up it.
Right.
So those gains must be coming from somewhere else, which is the near shore, the beach itself. Yeah. So let me just add that when I did these summations, I'm focusing purely on the back of the beach up into the dune area to define that. So I'm actually ignoring the stuff that's taking place down the beach itself, because I really wanted to focus on how much accumulation losses are taking place at the back of the beach, which is going to be the area that's responding most directly to storms and long-term patterns and things like that. Anything below the toe of the dune there is going to be subject to seasonal variations. And so my point is that those seasonal variations are very large and are probably contributing a lot of the other sand that we're not accounting for, we're not able to account for just with the losses taking place. Does that make sense?
I'll have to look at it some
Yeah.
more.
And so my other point would be that 200,000 over this period of time, when you talk about, what's it, 17, 18 years, is not a lot of sand relative to the total amount of sand in the system. It's still a small amount of sand.
You see this as something that's part of the decadal oscillation or something like that?
So
if
that's
it goes away, it's going to
yeah,
come back
yeah,
over
yeah.
a longer
Absolutely.
time scale.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll come back. Yeah. So my point is it's not new sand per se. It's still what you see is what you've got within that system. We can only account for what we can visibly see. There's a large chunk underwater there, and it's probably coming from that large chunk that's out on the surf side.
Thank you.
Main points to note there was obviously accretion is taking place north of Haystack Rock. Erosion is everywhere else in between except for Arch Cape. And then I mentioned North Cape, north of Akola Creek, it's gained around 288,000 cubic yards of sediment since 97. Positive gains of around 29,000 in the presidential dune management area, and then net losses everywhere else. We can start to break this down into changes that may be taking place over different time intervals. So from 97 to 98, this was a major El Nino, one of the biggest El Ninos to impact the Pacific Northwest since the previous event in 82, 83. The net change across the entire littoral south was a loss of about 41,000 cubic meters of sand. Erosion basically occurred everywhere except down in Falcon Cove, which I thought was quite interesting. I didn't expect to see that. I thought it'd be the reverse. Between 1998 and 2002, the cell basically continued to erode sand. It actually gained a little bit of sand back, so the net loss of that period was around 35,000 cubic yards. But it was still in negative territory. And so if you look at that upper plot and just the very top line there, you'll see the two bars on the right-hand side there. That's those two time intervals where at the end of 2002, the Cannon Beach cell was basically in a state of negative sand volume at that point, relative to 97 as our baseline. Going forward from 2002 to 2009, this is when we start to see very significant sand accumulation taking place. It basically gained about 164,000 cubic yards across the entire cell, of which the bulk of it was taking place north of Akola Creek and in the presidential area. And then everywhere else within the cell, it was effectively losing sediment at the time. And so when you sum these net losses, it makes up about 38% of the gains that were occurring north of Akola Creek. And that goes back to my point. So that sand must have been coming from other than the back of the beaches, either the intertidal zone out through into the breaker zone. And then from 2009 to 2016, we see additional accumulations taking place. We see erosion continuing to dominate, now starting to dominate in the very far south in Falcon Cove and Arch Cape areas. In the Chapman Point area, we can now estimate how much sand actually resides at different elevations. And so, for example, above the 39-foot contour, there's around 130,000 cubic yards of sand. If we were to drop it down to the 33-foot contour, this jumps to almost 260,000 cubic yards of sand. There's a lot of sand that's being contained in that dune management area. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and focus the last part of the presentation on some of the processes that are driving these changes and then some of the dune management responses. We know that there are multiple factors that really drive a lot of the changes that are taking place on our coastline. Large storm waves are really the driving mechanism for obviously all erosion response that we see. We've had several winters, particularly in the late 1990s, that produced unusually large winter storm conditions that elsewhere on the Oregon coast actually caused very dramatic changes. In the Cannon Beach cell, the responses weren't quite so dramatic. Sea level is an important factor since that determines how high waves reach at the back of the beach in order to erode into the dunes. We know that our tidal elevations undergoes a seasonal cycle from summer to winter. It rises, it actually increases in elevation between summer and winter time by about 25 centimeters. And then when you get an El Nino event, you effectively double that elevation. So that means that in an El Nino, you are effectively adding this much extra water height, or this much height to the surface of the ocean, which obviously allows waves to actually erode or reach into much higher elevations of the beach. And then periodically we get storm surges as well that may also further accentuate the ability for waves to erode. We see large shifts in sediment patterns in terms of sediment movement. We may get localized erosion due to development of rip currents. That's something that certainly sets up, particularly in late spring into early summer, but sometimes can develop over the winter season as well between large events. And obviously, longer term changes associated with sea level rise can also compound changes that take place on the beach. So I was getting ahead of myself. This is a graph that's showing the seasonal interannual variations in water levels along the Oregon coast based on a 50-year record from Newport on the south coast. So you've got time on the bottom, you've got mean sea level in meters on the left, mean sea level in feet on the right. The actual seasonal variation is shown in black here. So this is this 0.2 meter, 25 centimeter rise between summer and winter conditions. When you get a major El Nino, such as occurred in 1982-83, we see that it reaches almost 2 feet above the previous summer conditions, which obviously allows for waves to erode into beaches more significantly. We know from looking at long-term changes at our sea level gauges on the central coast that they're characterized by a progressive but slow rate of rise over the long term. It's, for Newport, it's around 0.9 millimeters per year. It doesn't seem like much. We know from studies that have been done recently by the National Academies looking at future projections of sea level rise for the Pacific Northwest. They were able to derive a number of scenarios for potential responses. What I've shown is a projection out into the future for sea level rise based on a mid-range forecast, which is this black dashed line. So expectations are for mean sea level to rise by as much as 60 centimeters by 2100, which would put it midpoint here. The grey shading reflects the uncertainty with respect to which models are used for projecting future temperature responses that obviously ultimately reflect back on how the ocean will respond accordingly. What I wanted to touch on, though, also is that this just assumes a normal, I mean, this doesn't account for the fact of how our tides experience this summer-winter variation. So when you factor in 60 centimeters on top of a winter condition, it pushes it up to closer to 80 centimeters. If you were to factor in an El Nino at 2100, now you're up around 1 meter by 2100. And if you're into talking about more extreme scenarios, then you're up around potentially 2 meters. So we're now talking 3 to 6 feet at 2100. Those are obviously very extreme scenarios that would have significant repercussions to our beaches and our coastline without, I mean, I have no hesitation in saying that, were they to take place in the future. You know, especially when we assume that our incidence of storms, the types of storms we experience remain unchanged, and certainly all the future model forecasts suggest that with respect to storminess, it's unlikely to change dramatically in the future. But accounting for these sea level rise changes would be a significant factor looking longer term with respect to management of our coastal beaches and dunes.
Are we moving into a La Nina now?
So we actually came out of a La Nina last year. 2015, 2016 was the third most significant. Sorry, El Nino or La Nina?
La Nina.
So actually, let me come back to that a little bit. If I forget about it, I'm going to show a plot of long-term changes of El Niños and La Niñas. And hopefully that'll remind me to come back to that one. So I did want to mention, obviously, that was based on one tide gauge. We can now look at what the changes are taking place along the entire coastline. And so what we can see is that effectively, to the right of this zero line here, this portion of the coast here is being transgressed by sea level, which means sea level is actually rising faster relative to the regional tectonics. So this portion of the coast is being effectively flooded over a very slow rate over the long term. On the south coast, south of about Coos Bay, it's the reverse. This is an emergent part of the coastline where its current rate of uplift is exceeding sea level rise. Cannon Beach is right at that transition as we go north into Seaside and up on southwest Washington coastline. They're in an area where tectonically it's exceeding the rate of sea level, current rates of sea level rise. So right here, we're at a juncture between this transition from transgression to emergence going north. And I'm going to skip this one because that basically just says the same thing. I wanted to touch on, actually probably going to run out of time. I'm going to skip that one. There's been some work done looking at wave climate changes over the last few decades. And so I, myself and some other colleagues published a paper about this where we were able to analyze multiple gauges along the entire US West coastline. And we found evidence of a shift in ocean waves from the 1970s through to the 1980s and up through the present. Basically a shift towards progressively increasing wave heights. And so the question I had was going based on, I mean, this was updated through 2001. I wanted to see what was going on up through 2017. And so I did a similar sort of assessment. And what we find is that the last decade effectively reverted back to conditions that were actually quieter storm-wise, wave-wise, compared with what we were experiencing in the 1970s. When you think about it, you know, if you've been out on the beaches over the last 10 years, you probably would have noticed, I mean, our winters have not really been that severe in terms of big storms, lots of erosion taking place and things like that. It's been a lot quieter than it was, say, in the late 1990s. And this graphic is actually supportive of that with respect to data measured offshore. We find that, for example, if you were to compare, this is a fit through all the hourly data from this gauge for different time periods. If you were to compare the current phase, where around the mean is about 2.8 meters relative to 3 meters, 3.2 meters in the previous decade in the late 1990s. So a slight shift towards a little bit smaller waves in this current sort of decade that we're looking at. And you see this most clearly up here, where this is actually plotting the actual observation numbers against the heights of the waves. Blue is the last decade in the late 1990s, red is the current, and we see we've just basically shifted everything to the left of that curve there. Our waves are currently smaller than they were 10, 20 years ago. The main point here is that, obviously with respect to storminess, we go through these cycles. You know, there are large fluctuations that take place. With respect to sediment transport, we know from work that's been done by Paul Komar, this is a conceptual model showing what's considered to be a normal year. Our waves predominantly come out of the west to southwest in the wintertime, and so that basically drives sand towards the north. Conversely, in summertime, waves are riding more from a west to northwesterly direction. That causes that sand to revert back to the south. So over many, many years, this natural pattern basically balances itself out. So the net transport is about zero. When we get an El Nino year, these processes are actually enhanced. We see the same, actually we see bigger waves coming out of the southwest. We see more erosion taking place at the southern ends of our pocket beach littoral south. We see more erosion at the north ends of Bay Mouse. And we see accumulation taking place at the north ends of the south. That reversal from the summer waves is not enough to compensate for the amount of sand that's been moved as a result of the higher wave energies in the preceding winter. So in this case here, in that example, there would be a net shift of sand towards the north end of the south. You can kind of get a sense of this when you look at what's happened down in the Rockaway South, just to our south. So between 1997 and 2002, this is an area that lost about 1.4 million cubic meters of sand. So you lost 35,000 cubic yards of sand between 1997 and 2002. These guys lost 1.4 million. And the reason being is probably because the storm tracks of the time, well, a couple of reasons. One is their geology, geomorphology is quite different from yours. It's all dune back down there, whereas up here, there's a large section of the coast is backed by bluffs. You have a lot of engineering, coastal engineering, that, particularly in the Tolvana Park area, that obviously mitigates against wave impact. Plus, at the time, those storm systems had actually been shifted a little further south. Main point I wanted to note, so large losses of sand down here, but the main point I wanted to note was, if you look at how the shorelines here, if you look at the black lines, you'll see how there's more erosion in the south, more accumulation in the north. And you see this for 3 different subsections in that Rockaway Cell. This is Bay Ocean Spit, Rockaway, Nehalem Spit in the north. And you see that reorientation of the shoreline, where sand is being taken from the south end of each of these subcells and pushed northwards, where it's building up against south of Tillamook Bay, south of Nehalem Bay, up against Neahkani Mountain in the far north. So these patterns here are actually analogous to what you're experiencing in the Cannon Beach South. There's been some work that was done by Anderson and Ruggiero trying to quantify these changes with respect to modeling the sediment transport flux based on wave conditions. They used a 40-year hindcast. And what they found was the net change based on all this data is actually, over the last few decades, has been driving sand northwards along our coastline. So the black is the mean. The red is what happens during a normal El Nino, a typical El Nino. The red dashed is an extreme El Nino, such as in 97, 98, and 82, 83. El Nino, La Nina, which is the opposite, that's when we tend to, we think we experience smaller waves under La Nina conditions. We would expect to see a reversal, waves coming more from the west to northwest under these conditions, so it would actually help to drive sand to the south there. So it's going to your question.
So why don't you have a balance of the La Nina with the El Nino so we can see the difference?
A balance between the two. So it turns out if you actually sum all of these, the net balance is 0. But when you get periods, decadal periods like 20 to 30 year cycles,
right,
you'll actually see a net movement to the north. And so these guys actually did do some modeling that supports that conclusion of northward accumulation. I haven't included that as a graphic here, but they have actually confirmed that over the last decade from 76 through the late 1990s, during that time, the amount of sand going northward along our south was exceeding the amount that was being returned southward. So there's more sand accumulation in the north. And so this was trying to get at these interannual variations. The black arrows there are major El Ninos. The dashed lines show these decadal fluctuations. So we can see that the most current phase from 76 through now has been dominated by 2 of the strongest El Ninos on record, a lot more El Nino conditions, fewer La Ninas. There was a slight reversal in 2000, more La Nina conditions, less El Nino. There's some speculation that we may be going back to this phase now, which would mean more El Niños, more sediment moving northward, potentially, if this model pans out. So we can also, actually running out of time. There were some questions about, erosion potential on the dunes themselves, and so there are a couple of ways we can actually address this. We can use some geometric models that were developed by various researchers, which are based on the storm-induced wave run-up coupled with tides. And based on that, we can estimate that for Kennebec beaches, that maximum potential erosion is somewhere on the order of around 160 to 260 feet, so 50 to 80 meters. The average for up this area is around 65 meters. Seems like those are big numbers. That's the amount of erosion that potentially could take place in an extreme storm. In reality, beaches and dunes and storms don't work like that. That assumes that there's unlimited, that storm will last the full length required to erode the beach to that extent. And in reality, that doesn't take place. Also, when beaches and dunes are eroded down during major storms, that sand is taken offshore, forms bars. That starts to have a mitigating effect on the waves themselves and reducing their potential to do further erosion. So we can actually factor in a duration adjustment factor into the modelling, and we can come up with estimates that are probably closer to 8 to 13 metres, which is in that bottom bullet there, which was actually derived by myself and colleagues as part of our Clatsop hazard study. I should point out that historical data for this area indicates somewhere around 8 to 20 metres, so 26 to 66 feet is what we've actually measured from LiDAR, acknowledging that that's probably not a single storm, that probably reflects multiple storms because it reflects when these surveys were measured. But a not unreasonable storm-induced erosion of around 8 metres to 13 metres is probably a reasonable guide going forward with respect to protecting the dunes themselves, or understanding how much the dunes...
Horizontal distance.
Correct, yes. Yeah. So switching gears a little bit towards the dunes themselves. So what are dunes? These are large aggradational features at the back of the beach. They form when sand is obviously transported inland, where it becomes trapped by a variety of mechanisms, be it vegetation, flotsam, wrack, dune fencing, things like that, mechanisms that are able to contain the sand. Even the roughness of the more ephemeral dunal features that develop can actually start to create some feedback mechanism, further enhancing that trapping mechanism. Dunes provide obviously very important ecosystem services with respect to habitat. They're obviously important with respect to sites of high tourism value. They can be used for groundwater recharge zones. And obviously they play a fundamental role with respect to coastal protection. They are a natural barrier against storms. And every effort should be taken to try to maintain that barrier as much as possible in order to minimize the need to go towards having to resort to expensive engineering approaches, riprap, seawalls and things like that, which may in the longer term have other sorts of repercussions. They're also critical with respect to preventing flooding from highway run-up and overtopping. Dunes build because they require a large sediment supply. They need strong winds in order to be able to entrain the sand and transport the sand. The winds need to be blowing from the right directions. And then obviously mechanisms to trap that sand inland. They're maintained also through natural littoral processes. These are obviously the processes that are taking place on the beach itself, in the breaker zone, in the surf zone, which are moving sediment up and down our coastline. And what I've been I guess, alluding to over the last 15 minutes or so of this discussion is that there's strong evidence pointing to the fact that our processes in the littoral zone currently appear to be driving that sand more in a northerly direction towards the north end of the canopy itself. They're enhanced by wind processes, and then obviously ecological processes as well come into play with respect to containing them. Erosion of the dunes is entirely controlled by storms, and the other important point to make note of here is that their recovery can take many years in some cases. In the example of the erosion changes taking place down in the Rockaway Littoral Cell, down in Nesquin, places like Pacific City, there are portions of those dunes there that have really not fully recovered to a state prior to the 97-98 El Nino winter storms. So going on almost 20 years now, they're still in either a damaged state or they're continuing to erode. So it can take many years for these dune features to recover following major events. So we did a study looking at, as part of this work here, we wanted to try and get a better handle on the wind component that's driving sand along the coastline. We know that obviously the waves are moving sand along the beaches more in a northerly direction. We wanted to see what the wind was like. Since that's the part that actually takes the sand from that intertidal zone and transports it back up into the dunes. So this is based on a record from Yaquina Bay. It's a record going back to the mid-1980s, I think it is. And we can essentially break it down into its seasonal components, winter, spring, summer, and fall. And it confirms that obviously in the fall and winter months, southerlies are dominant along our coastline, not surprisingly. And then in summer and spring and summer, we see northwesterlies being the other obviously dominant directional component. We can extrapolate various statistics from these different seasons to try to break it down a little bit more to see which season tends to be windier compared with others. What's the propensity for higher wind speeds? When are they more likely to occur? Not surprisingly, highest wind speeds take place in fall and winter conditions and are substantially greater than summer and spring and summer conditions. So, for example, we find that for 1% of the time, wind speeds exceed 38 miles per hour in fall and winter, compared with 29 miles per hour in summer. So those are large differences. If we were to break it down, say for 20% of the time, we see 18 miles per hour for winter conditions, down to 15 miles per hour in summer. We can also see that from these data that there's a strong diurnal signature, not surprisingly, with stronger winds tending to kick in late morning into afternoon. And the difference between spring and summer conditions in terms of that diurnal variability are not as pronounced as in wintertime. So we can take these data a little bit further. We can actually use a sand transport equation developed by Bagnall in the 1940s to try to extrapolate where the sand may be going. And the upper plot there is the product of that calculation where we sum across all hourly data, focusing on the two components, the northerlies and the southerlies. And we can confirm that the sand transport is largely bimodal, not surprisingly. Southwesterly winds are dominating in fall and winter again, driving sand northwards. North to northwesterly winds are dominating in spring and summer, causing that reversal. If we were to focus on just these two wind components and then sum across northerly transport versus southerly transport, we find that northerly directed transport is about 4 times greater than transport back to the south in this period, which means that there's more sand being blown northwards by wind relative to the return to the south. So again, we now have littoral processes driving sediment north. We have wind processes driving sand northwards and onto the dunes. Both, in my view, are pretty robust in terms of confirming where the sediments are going. We can start to look at what's the seasonal propensity of those northerly and southerlies, which is that lower graphic. And what we find is that obviously highest winds in January and December obviously have a large, high capacity to transport a lot of sediment. So a lot of sand moving in these times relative to the summer season. So that's the summer blue here. So again, this is just confirming that based on these equations, it appears to be more sediment moving northward relative to southward from the northerlies. We can use this information potentially to maybe say, well, what's the best time to do any form of dune scraping? This is a crazy time to be doing it in the middle of winter, obviously, because any time between January, March, October through December, in reality, whatever you scrape off that dune there and push out on the beach is going to get blown back onto the dune itself. And so it's just not, you're going to be reworking material on a constant basis. And we know that on our coastline, even under high rainfall conditions, very wet conditions, that sand is moving. A lot of sand is moving under these wet, windy conditions in wintertime. So if I was to focus on a time that may be best for actually doing dune scraping activities, I would probably be targeting in the May through August timeframe, May through July timeframe, when there's more of a potential to, or less of a potential for that sand to be reworked back into the dunes itself. If you were to pick late summer, wind velocities are generally much lower at that point in time, and so what you run the risk of is that you push the sand out in late summer and you transition to fall, those southerlies kick in and it just entrains that sand and pumps it back into the dune itself. So from a timing perspective, I think it would be probably better to focus on a late spring, early summer timeframe if that's a desired outcome for him to do the work. And it's just an example. This was a major storm.
From what I remember, I remember, when the dune grading, since I've been involved in this, they scraped it off and put it down near the water so that it's washed off into the ocean rather than being blown like this out.
Right. So yes. So that's perfectly viable. You're right. Yeah. So that's yeah. The only comment I make is that if you look at the cross sections, what we see is that obviously we're pushing it seaward. That's fine. I would just argue that it's important that you stabilize whatever you place seaward of the dune itself in order to minimize the potential for it to be reworked back into the dunes. There's also no guarantees. I mean, we've had a number of fairly quiet winters that you may not see a lot of that sand taken offshore, as in it may not be eroded by wind waves. So there's a potential for it to sit out on the beach there, going into winter and then being re-entrained potentially. But your point is right, yes. I mean, that is the objective, is to allow either the wind to move some of that sand back southward or allow the waves to actually entrain it and take it offshore. My one comment would be is both processes are are working against you right now, because everything is pointing towards sand wanting to move northward in that cell there. So it's really just being contained in that localized area offshore from Haystack Rock to Chapman Point effectively. Is that a sustainable approach? I mean, that's something that you all have to grapple with. One of the recommendations I made in the report is potentially looking at doing some sort of combination of the existing approach, as well as perhaps trucking some of that sediment down and placing it, say, down in the south central part of the south, where it's an area that's undergoing active erosion, and supplementing its sediment budget down there. Obviously, recognizing that in the long term, assuming the conditions remain the same the way they are going right now, it'll eventually work its way up to the north end. But that's probably a more, I think it's more effective long-term approach, doing it that way than just relying on nature to try and move the sand forward. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah.
You make a point in the report, and you've made it a couple times tonight, that wet sand blows. Does it blow more or less than dry sand?
So the point is, so dry sand in summertime, wind velocities are lower anyway. And so you may not see as much sand moving around in summertime relative to wintertime, where the velocities are substantially greater, and regardless of the fact whether it's dry or damp, it's moving. And so this is an example here where this is from Pacific City, taken in 2001, where this was a large winter storm, very heavy rainfall along the coastline. That sand that's actually been blowing up onto the dunes there, those are around 50-foot high dunes at the south end of Pacific City. As you go north of there, we've seen that bottom photograph. They have no management plan other than to scrape that sand and push it seaward. They don't do any replanting, any stabilization, anything like that. That is a constant problem for them. Another example of an ineffective approach like that is at Elsie Bay down in Lincoln County, where, again, there is no concerted plan to try to control what's going on out there. So, put it this way, dry sand in the middle of winter with the high velocities, it's going to move.
I was looking for a comparison.
Yeah.
In terms of, if it's wet sand and it moves, does it move faster? Does it take far more of a gust to move it than dry sand?
I would say probably yes.
By the way, this Pacific City picture you have here, I grew up in Pacific City for a lot of summers, and where those houses are, they were never there when I was a kid, and that all blew up into the dunes that were
Right.
back in mine.
Right.
And
Well, I mean, that's, you know, if you want to,
it was like a snowstorm.
Right.
For the most part.
and if you want to argue anything
That was in the
about,
summer.
if you want to argue anything about building on the Oregon coast, you know, this is a classic example where you should be building on a dune, on an active dune system. I mean, there are many examples like this up and down the coast. I mean, this is the challenge you face. I should point out that there's a riprap wall about 30 feet in front of those houses there,
Right.
that was built in 1978 as a result of extreme storms. So they've gone from one extreme end member of massive erosion that almost took out all those homes to now having more sand than they can deal with, because that sand's coming from Nisquam that's lost all their beach in June. But this is the Oregon coast, and you know, these are the conditions that we deal with, and I mean, it's a very, very dynamic environment, and so, you know, one needs to be cautious. So, last few slides, I just want to talk about some recent work that's been done by researchers at Oregon State, actually examining various dune grasses and the morphological responses to the, different types of grasses. So we know that there are 3 species of dune grass that have a direct bearing on our dune morphology. Ammophila arenaria, European beach grass, Breville gallata, which is a non-native American beach grass. It was actually introduced from the Great Lakes and US East Coast area. And the native beach grass, E. mollis, which we find in a few pockets, discrete pockets up and down the Oregon coast. European beach grass was basically introduced in the early 1900s, primarily in the Coos Bay area initially, and then up on the Clatsop Plains. Breville gallata was actually introduced into the Warrenton area in the 1930s, early 1940s. And the comment I wanted to make here was that prior to their introduction, effectively our beaches and dunes were virtually devoid of significant vegetation. And a case in point, here's that bottom graphic on the right there, which is Chapman Point, showing the inland extent of sand blowing in amongst the old Pleistocene terraces here. Breakers Point condos would be up here in that active dune area. But there's no question that dune grass has single-handedly transformed the character of the Oregon coast. There's just no doubt about that. So Zernitsky's and others using various wind experiments and plantings of these different types of plant species, what they identified was certain characteristics between how the plant grows and the morphology of the dunes. They found that basically European beach grass, because of its tiller, which is the branches of the grass itself, produces a very dense structure. It's able to grow very quickly and respond very quickly to that high inflow of sand. It also has a tendency to grow vertically. And as a result of that sort of combination, it's actually very effective at trapping sand and also building dunes taller and broader. In contrast, Breville gallata has a much more lateral growth pattern. So as sand starts to accumulate around its root structure, its tillers, it starts sending out lateral tillers. And so by that virtue, it actually allows the dune to actually build seaward and build lower, broader dune system. And E. mollis, which is the native species, has a very similar character to Breville gallata. It turned out from the wind experience, E. mollis is actually a much more efficient grass for trapping sand, even though it's not as successful on the Oregon coast. And the reason for it is that its tiller density is the lowest of the 3 species. And as a result, it tends to be outgrown, outpaced by Breville gallata and arenaria. So the bottom line from their wind tunnel experiments, they found that European beach grass really performs the best and is very effective at trapping sand, and by that virtue, growing vertically to compensate. Too many clicks. So here's a series of plots from the Chapman Point area, 1939 on the left, 67 in the middle, and a contemporary with a photo with LiDAR on the right there, showing shoreline positions. We know from Chuck Rosenfeld's study and from looking at aerial photos, dune plantings probably began sometime after the 1950s. If you look at the aerial photo in 67, quite a bit of that shoreline and dune area had been stabilized. And really, from about the 1970s, this whole area has been pretty effectively managed particularly in response to major storms in the 1980s, in an effort to try and contain sand, obviously, that's being blown inland and amongst houses and causing problems that way. So obviously, again, the red dashed line just shows the vegetation line in 1939. The yellow is the 39 shoreline, and then you can see up through to the present. This whole area has built seaward, and the dune, end of the sort of dune complex here is starting to drift southward, pushing Ecola Creek towards the south here with it. So, with respect to managing the system, there are really three key objectives to keep in mind. Obviously, one is to ensure that the dunes maintain an adequate sand volume. This is important with respect to using dunes themselves as a natural barrier to mitigate against storm waves, to minimize potential for erosion and wave overtopping. The second objective is to maintain any weak points that may develop in the dune system itself. Most commonly, this takes place next to trails. It's probably the most common one. So that may involve repairing those areas, dealing with blowouts that may take place because of strong windstorms or localized wave erosion effects, and recognizing that the recovery of these areas is not immediate. It takes time. And so obviously be mindful that using plantings and or fences to try to restabilize areas is a good way to accelerate the recovery of these areas. Dunes obviously also provide very valuable habitat for plants and animals, and so that's another consideration to keep in mind. In areas undergoing significant accretion, such as north end of Cannon Beach South, there's obviously a fourth objective, which is to implement some sort of dune management plan to try and contain and deal with the aggradation that may be taking place. And so obviously it's very important to balance these competing goals and objectives, and recognizing also that there's uncertainties with respect to how we understand the physical system. I mean, we still are learning what's going on out there. We still don't have a definitive idea as to whether this current phase is going to be maintained as we go forward in time, or we may see a reversal, and conditions may actually completely change, and we may start to see sand moving back towards the south, and eventually there may be problems at the north end with respect to erosion. I mean, these are things that we just don't have a good handle on, and so that requires care with respect to developing a good management approach that's adaptive to the conditions at hand, and that must be, in all honesty, must be guided by ongoing monitoring and assessment of what's taking place in those areas. I mean, that's absolutely key to informing the decision-making process. So, with respect to a number of specific questions about continuing any sort of dune scraping plans in the area, so my first question would be, how low? Well, based on the work that we've done with respect to extreme 100-year assessments of total water levels for Cannon Beach, we find that those elevations are around 23 to 25 feet, depending on which transect site you're using at the north end of the Cannon Beach South. Hence, incorporating the city's 4-foot factor of safety, one could conceivably move towards a design crest of around 27 to 28 feet potentially. When you start lowering the dune to those sort of elevations, you're starting to talk about potentially releasing a lot of sand into the system. And so in the case here, if you were to remove sand above the 33-foot contour in the Chapman Point Dune Management Area, that would potentially release around 256,000 cubic yards of sand, of which 63,000 is south of Fifth Street. I mean, that's a substantial amount of sand that would be placed on the beach if one were to do it in any one point in time. And so, being mindful that that may not be an effective approach for a variety of reasons, maybe the approach to take is doing some sort of phased approach. And I did also want to say that if you were to obviously drop this to that 8.7 meter or 8.2 meter elevation, then potentially you're going to be incorporating another 60 to 100,000 cubic yards on top of that. So now we're talking a pretty substantial amount of sand that could be deposited out on the beach in any one point in time.
I looked at the topo maps of that area on the city's website this afternoon, and it looked like the street level at the end of 5th Street, and the ground just inland from the dunes was about 50 feet, NAD 88. Are you contemplating recommending that we could safely grade down to the dunes in front of there to something like 27 to 28 and a half feet?
I'm not recommending that at all.
Glad I asked.
No, I mean, I'm just saying these are what-if scenarios. If you were to actually, if you were to lower it to that elevation, then yeah, I mean, it's going to change things very dramatically in that area, and it would potentially release a lot of sand. It really comes down to what is the purpose of the plan going forward. And that's something that you all have to be honest, and that's what you're grappling with.
Let me rephrase the question. In your view, would it be safe to reduce, in terms of the dunes preventing overtopping and inundation and so forth?
So it would be safe with respect to what we know now in terms of the extreme heights. If you were to push all that sand seaward, it's obviously going to create a lot more buffer. It would be a very flat structure at that point in time, and you would have a lot more horizontal extent in front of the buffering capacity in front of those homes now. Is that effective? Again, that's not my decision. My comment would be that it goes back to what is the purpose. If the purpose is view shed, do you necessarily need to lower it to 27 feet to have view shed? So those are the considerations that you all have to be thinking about.
In reading this, I was seeing that as how high does it need to be adequately protected?
Right.
The amount that FEMA is telling
So
you
the
and the amount that the city is
right. So the key thing here is, I mean, based on what we have been able to assess from looking at the storm history, characteristics of the beach, and so on, a 100-year storm is probably around 7.5 meters in terms of total waters. So that's how high that run-up is reaching at the back of the beach, accounting for around 10 to 20 meters of potential retreat in that storm as well. And then you have to think about, well, okay, relative to where does that line reach? And then where are your homes? Is there a sufficient buffer there to continue to mitigate against subsequent storms after that?
Sure.
Those are all the considerations. If you were to lower it, again, to that 27 feet, then obviously you're pushing a lot of sand seaward. Is that sand going to stay there? If it stays there, well, I would argue that probably quite a bit of it will stay there, at least until the next major extreme storm that we get, when some of it will disappear. That'll buy, that's a buffering capacity that will be there. Does that answer your question?
No, but that's
Yeah. I mean, these are again, I go back to my point before. What is the purpose behind scraping the dunes? And I think that has to be first and foremost in your mind. And is it realistic to lower the dune to elevations that are being proposed here? I mean, I would argue these are minimum values.
Sure.
I would certainly not be counselling that you go anything lower than this. I think it'd be ridiculous, crazy, based on what we've seen and what we know from what's taken place elsewhere.
And does this have any relation to the FEMA flood maps? And if we make those changes, would that affect what they say now?
Right. Yes. So the current FEMA flood maps for this area have an extreme elevation, a total water level elevation, a base flood elevation that's higher than what we came up with.
Right.
I think their elevation is closer to 30 feet.
What is it, Bruce?
31.
31.
Right.
At Breaker's Point.
So these would be dropping, these are about 3 feet. Even accounting for the plus 4 feet is about 3 feet lower.
Would that change the rates then?
That's not going to impact on the rates themselves. It doesn't impact the rates. It's just, it comes down to a question, again, what is the purpose? Do you really need to lower the dune to 27 feet to maintain a view shed?
That is the question.
Your question was about insurance rates, right?
It is.
Yeah. My understanding is if we maintain FEMA +4, then it wouldn't compromise your insurance rates.
So the answer is no, it wouldn't.
Right, because this is.
If you reduced it to 27 to 20.
According to the FEMA rules.
Yeah, according to the FEMA rules, yeah.
So then there's the question of obviously where to dispose of or place the sand. We've talked about obviously sand is scraped seaward, placed over the seaward face of the fore-dune. Obviously the most important thing, I mean I can't stress enough, and you probably already got a sense of this from other studies that have been done, retaining sand in the littoral system is absolutely paramount. We would not be supportive of any practice of removing sand from the physical system. I mean, that goes against everything we stand for and argue for with respect to protecting our beaches and dunes along the Oregon coast. So maintaining sand in the system is absolute paramount.
The regulatory setup for this also precludes that.
Right. So it's typically scraped seaward. We think probably the best time to do this is probably in late spring into early summer. Once you get into late summer time frames, wind speeds are just generally much lower. And so, I mean, it requires about just under 6 meters per second to actually mobilize and train the sand. And so that when you start to look at the percentage of time at which sand can be mobilized, it really reduces down quite significantly in that late summer time frame. It probably goes towards your question about dry sand versus wet sand movement. I propose that sand could potentially be trucked from one location to another, and that would avoid the issue of reworking sand that may be placed seaward of one dune management area. It could also be viewed as an approach to enhance another area that may be actively losing sediment.
Well, in your report, you speak of it as a less palatable solution. I don't understand that. It sounds like a value judgment on this. I'm not sure.
Well, the issue is, do you really want to see trucks, 1,000 trucks, 10,000 truckloads driving up and down the beach there, carrying sand from one area to another? It's never been done on the Oregon coast, at least not that I'm aware of. There are timing issues with respect to tourism. Obviously, a day like today, you're not going to be driving any truck out on the beach there. There's so many people out on the beach there. People are very protective of their beach, the Oregon beaches.
But you're saying basically that it would be better for the whole cell to do that, for the whole beach.
I'm saying it's an option. that it's another option that's available that allows for a more direct response.
Well,
from-
would it be better for the whole beach to do that? In other words, since it's eroding on the south, if you were to take the sand south, wouldn't that be better for the beach as a whole?
I don't dispute that, no. I think it's perfectly justifiable approach. I mean, that's what we see taking place elsewhere in the United States, where sand is actively dredged and placed on beaches because those beaches are losing sediment. It's
And is
a
it successful?
sure, in those areas where there's a large sand availability to do that. Let me rephrase that. It's successful short term. It's an expensive undertaking, at least on the East Coast, because they're dredging material from the seabed and placing it directly on the beach that way. That sand can be removed in 1 or 2 winter storms. You get a hurricane on the East Coast, and that investment can be gone in a single event. So, you know, it's a risk you take. But I'm just suggesting that it's an option for you to look at as a possibility to remove some of the sand from one area, keeping it within the system and placing it in an area that's currently undergoing erosion.
I guess I'm just trying to pin you down. I must say that you think that it would be better for the beach as a whole, as far as the health of the whole beach. Taking out of, not counting for the extra financial burden.
For some period of time.
I think it's a justifiable approach for some period of time.
It's still not gonna say.
100 years.
Not to get into a long conversation, but is there a reason not to contemplate trucking it down the highway instead of along the beach? Okay,
I can't comment on that. I mean, that's, you know, I mean, obviously that's that's probably going to be, I mean, there's many factors come into play there that, you know, you have to consider.
So, one of the other variables is what you plant. And you give pretty enthusiastic support to the effectiveness of Oregon dune grass.
Right.
And the question I have about that is how long does it take for that to establish itself?
So I can't comment on that because, I mean, that's not my area of expertise by any means. All I can comment on is the work that Phoebe Zaneski did with Sally Hacker and co, where they found that, you know, based on these responses with different dune grasses, Breville gallata and E. mollis are more conducive to building these large dunes. I mean, the issue at Chapman Point is a product of planting European beach grass. It's a combination of factors. It's large sediment supply and it's planting the European beach grass. European beach grass, by its virtue of the way it grows and its trapping mechanism, wants to build up, and it's going to build a taller dune by that virtue. Whereas Breville gallata has this tendency to go laterally. So I would argue, and I think this is where the discussion may want to be directed at a botanist for their input. But I would, you know, my sense is from reading the literature, I think experimenting with Breville gallata or E. mollis is a reasonable way to go. I think it's a much more reasonable way to go than planting European beach grass, personally. E. mollis is a native to the Pacific Northwest. We should be using it. There are places, you know, Cape Lookout State Park. State Park's planted E. mollis there. It works very effectively. It's actually on an engineered dune. It's worked very effectively there. It does die back in the winter time, which is maybe one negative against it, because it will die down and becomes this mat of dead leaves. But it resprouts in spring and grows very quickly after that. There are pockets of it down in the South Beach area in Newport. So I think it's worth exploring. I certainly, given the current situation, the existing approaches, I think this is a new way to go, and I think it's definitely worth considering.
I reacted to the same thing that Joe did. I don't know whether you had heard about this, but I think it was the last time that we had discussions about dune grading, and the planning commission directed the people who were going to be doing the work to replant with native plants, and I don't remember which state agencies said, no, you can't do that. Oregon State Parks said, no, you can't do that. You think they're more likely to listen to you than to us?
I'm actually, Mark and I were talking about that earlier, and to be honest, I'm actually quite surprised that they took that stance.
It was because it would fill up more quickly.
Well, I guess my response to that is that I think we need to provide some material to them to give them some sense of where the science is going, at least on this subject. And this is a study that was done by botanists, and their findings point to the fact that Breville gallata is becoming a dominant species up on the Washington coast in particular, and the four dunes out there are significantly lower and broader than our dunes here, and it's very consistent with what they've found physically in the field, as well as what they're finding in wind tunnel experiments. That's why I think it's worth exploring and having that discussion. And I'd be happy to talk to the folks at State Parks about this a little bit more. But I do think it's worth maybe perhaps even approaching Sally Hacker at Oregon State University. I mean, she's a professor in botany and has been studying these types of dune grass responses on the Oregon coast for several years now. I know she, both Sally and Phoebe did express some concerns about Breville gallata, in that on the Washington coast it's become a dominant species to the point where it's starting to shut out other types of species. And so she was concerned about the more of a homogeneous structure in which the biology tends to go with Breville gallata compared with the European beach grass. And I'm sure she'll speak to that more eloquently than I could. So this is just a conceptual profile of really almost wrapping up now of kind of the concept if one were to go down this path, and that is to obviously scrape sediment off the top of the dunes has been done before, pushing it seaward. If one were to focus on Breville gallata or E. mollis, then potentially you could build this very broad dune system that would be stabilized, allowing for more of that dune growth to be pushed ever seaward as the dune system grows with it. So that's essentially the concept in mind behind going down this approach. And if you were to stick with European beach grass, then in reality that little bump that's down the seaward there would start happening on the very top of the dune there, and it would start building vertically again, and you're back to that issue of dealing with losing view shed and so on. Just a couple of final comments on Akola Creek. I know that I think the city, Mark, had implemented some remediation work using these coconut core rolls to try and stabilize that south end of Breakers Point there. Chuck Rosenfeld commented on the fact that Akola Creek had fluctuated quite a bit over the years. I'm not sure I can take a lot from his early historical data because we don't know what the river stage was doing at the time. What he does indicate is that obviously leading up to the late 1990s, there seemed to be a more northward directed shift in Akola Creek, pushing up into Breakers Point area into here, and that's definitely perfectly reasonable idea, and it's borne out in the LiDAR data that we're seeing. We're seeing more enhanced erosion taking place here. Part of that is a product of the fact that this is pushing ever southward. You've had a lot of accumulation of sand that's been building up in this bend here, so it's forcing the creek to push up to the north there. That issue is not going to go away anytime soon, and it's going to remain a recurring problem and a challenge with respect to how to deal with it. pushing more sand out here could potentially cause some exacerbation of the problems there, particularly if it's coincides with some sort of strong flooding event where you've got a lot of water flow coming down a Colla Creek. He did talk about the fact that during storms, when this is opened up in wintertime, there is wave propagating up through into the channel there. I don't dispute that. I think that's, I fully accept that. I've seen evidence of that elsewhere on the coast. And certainly that could cause some localized scarring. The fact that all this wooden bulkhead engineering here, is a testament to the fact that it's a very dynamic area. Anywhere you've got rivers and creeks flowing out onto the beach, interacting with waves, this is a very, very dynamic, highly erosional area. So you tend to see a lot of changes taking place in those areas. An alternative suggestion for a potential soft remediation is something that we've been working with various institutions on using what's called a dynamic revetment or a gravel berm. This is an example from the Hatfield Marine Science Centre in Newport. This is the only example on the Oregon coast where it's an in-water application within an estuary. It's basically using nature, more of a natural soft engineering approach where you're trying to emulate nature effectively. So we know from many studies around the world that gravel beaches actually provide significant protection to beaches because of the fact that it requires a lot more energy to mobilize and train gravel than it does with sand. And so it has a tendency to stay put. You may see it moving laterally a little bit more along a shore, but generally it's not going to be eroded and removed offshore into deeper water. And the reason for that is the current velocities required to train and move coarser cobbles and gravels is strongest in the onshore direction than the offshore direction. So it has a greater propensity to move onshore and pile up, building the gravel berm accordingly. So that's an option there. There are two open coast applications where dynamic revetments have been constructed. One is Cape Lookout State Park, where they use large cobbles. So that's fully exposed to the open ocean there. It's a reasonable approach there because there's an existing cobble beach at the back of the beach, so they're simply enhancing what is naturally there anyway. There is a newer application where a cobble beach is constructed at the mouth of the Columbia River on the South Jetty. And we've been monitoring and studying its evolution there, and it's again exposed to a very highly dynamic and extreme wave environment, and it's performing remarkably well to date.
If we were imagining doing this, are you thinking of putting the gravel up along the toe of the dunes?
Yeah, I mean that's basically the concept that one could explore. I mean, I think this is something that you probably want to work with a fluvial geomorphologist or a fluvial engineer. In that, I mean, they may suggest, for example, in the case of Hatfield, this is the third phase in the construction of this gravel beach, and in this latest phase, there was a decision to add these root wads, which add the root wads, the roots, the big tree trunks.
Oh.
These here. So these were added. They weren't there naturally, and so they're actually chained and keyed into the beach itself, held in place so they don't float away.
Yeah.
And the idea was to create some habitat for fisheries and biology in the sand bed and so on. So I mean maybe some sort of application using that technique in conjunction with cobbles may be not unreasonable, assuming that the core rolls, there were problems with those. And I'll leave it at that.
Are there other questions from members of the commission at this point?
And I apologize for taking so long. I probably repeated myself too much.
Will you close the door?
That's okay.
Put it all the way.
Okay, then bearing in mind, my feeling is that at this point, I'm not expecting people to be trying to testify or to make speeches or whatever this evening, but just reminding you that I've asked not to. Are there questions that people would like to ask Dr. Allen? Bruce?
I'd like to thank Dr. Allen for bringing us a report that's based on modern technology and modern calculations. And therefore, I would ask the question that if this observations and calculations are comparable to the Rosenfeld report, does that make the 97 management plan current and up to date?
You asking me that question?
I am.
So I think that's obviously that's the next phase, is that discussion. Do I think it's current and up to date? I think there are elements of the science, and I'm only comment on the science of it, there are elements of it that are certainly correct. Obviously there's a lot more updated information we have available to us now through our understanding of sediment transport patterns that have been taking place that supersede and or clarify some of the assumptions that Rosenfeld and others came to. So, you know, with respect to that, I don't have a problem with that.
Okay. And then just one other question, please. I've got 20, but I'm limiting it to 2. I guess I would ask that I see your conclusion was to place it at the 19-foot line, saying deposition at the 19-foot level, which is what you're illustrating as the toe. Yeah, as the toe. How about a study of deposition into the intertidal zone and its effect upon anadromous fish and clams? Because that was one of the issues that we were battling with, and I haven't had time to read this word for word, but with my scanning, I didn't see that addressed. I'm wondering whether that will be addressed.
So I'm not going to comment on anything with respect to impacts to biology, because that's not my field of expertise.
Yeah.
That's where you want to have perhaps some conversations with folks at ODFW to get a better handle on that stuff. I know it's something that they're keenly interested themselves with respect to how obviously any mollusks living in the beach there respond to different amounts of sand input, and they've been doing a tremendous amount of research and work in that area, and I think they're obviously best qualified to comment more directly on that. With respect to the 19 foot contour, I focus on that primarily because recognizing that, at least my understanding is that in order to go below mean high water, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but you need to get permits from Corps of Engineers.
Yeah. Right.
And so that's obviously another step that one has to go through. And so my focus has always been on the upper part
Above
of the
the
beach.
mean high water. All right. So I guess the question is to the chair, will we pursue that information as we feel that it's part of the relevant documentation to the sand management plan that needs to be implemented before the operation is put in? Because that's what we were debating, and I was surprised that we didn't get this into the scientific aspects of this sand management. Thank you.
Other people have questions? Dan?
I just wonder, as far as climate change, you said a number of times that we, of course, cannot predict what's going to happen, and as nobody can in this day and age. So how do you feel as a scientist that has studied this very deeply, as anyone can see? What do you suggest as far as how can we, in our communities, find a balance when we have such a hard time really knowing scientifically what is coming in the next decades? It's
So,
confusing.
So the challenge, and I think go back to a comment I made, and actually it's not my comment, it's actually remarks from some other colleagues, and that is, in any situation like this, it is paramount that you have some sort of adaptive management approach to whatever it is you're taking or doing when it's on a beach and on dunes. You need to be tracking closely what's taking place in that system over time in order to be able to adjust your responses accordingly.
Thank you.
Mr. Patrick?
Yeah, I think the big revelation that I got, and I want to make sure I understand it, is that when you say that you push sand from, let's say, the toe, behind the toe, out into the littoral cell, meaning subterranean cell, that sand is really still a part of that sand barrier. And I've never heard that analysis before.
Right.
So what you're saying is, even though we're talking about a 33-foot height, when you move, let's say, 20 feet of sand from behind the 33-foot level, and you push it out into the littoral cell in the water, it really hasn't been removed from what we call as the protective factor.
No, I mean, right, so the point is that as long as you are not physically extracting sand, your sand mining, as long as you're keeping the sand within the system, that's a reasonable approach to take. As long as, again, going back to my comment previously about taking an adaptive management approach and responding based on good information over time as to what's taking place in that area. But yes, if you are extracting sand from one portion of the dune there and placing it out on the beach, it's still within the system. Obviously, storm waves are going to do what it wants to do and take some of that offshore, some of it will be redistributed elsewhere. It's still within the system. The issue, again, goes back to whether you start to see any shift in the overall response of what the beaches and dunes are doing over the longer term. And that's where you might have to start to perhaps rein in whatever approach you're doing, and may mean shifting your focus somewhere else that's either gaining sand or eroding, things like that. That's why you have to have the adaptive management. And so within, with respect to littoral systems, yeah, I mean, it's the conventional approach is that, it's within the boundaries of your, let's say in this case in Oregon, it's within the boundaries of your littoral cells. The littoral system here probably extends to around 14 meters water depth on average, based on the characteristics of the storm waves. I mean, it's generally accepted as a reasonable estimate. There's evidence in some areas where we may see the littoral zone actually extend even down to 60 feet, 20 meters water depth, because we see large movements of sandbars. So it's in that transition, 14 to 20 meters in that region there is kind of the seaward extent. And obviously it shifts from average wave climate to climate. Yeah. It's a big system.
Mark?
What year was Cape Lookout planted?
So Cape Lookout, the dynamic revetment there was constructed in late summer of 1999. They actually built the artificial dune first, and then they built the dynamic revetment in 2000. I think it was summer of 2000. So it was done in a phased approach.
Okay, thank you. Sir?
Mark Tweetmeyer, only placing it at Large Street. What's the next step? So we heard the 1997 study, we've got this. What's the next step?
We go home.
Good question.
Yeah, we go home tonight.
You go home and I can go home and we'll lock the building. There's two more things that have to happen. This is the science half of this project. There's a policy half of it too that would take the recommendations in this study, translate them into policy and regulatory language, and we'd have a vetting of that step in a room much like this with quite possibly the same people. then the planning commission would go into public hearings on those two documents, the science study that we just talked about tonight and this policy portion, which is yet to be written. Planning commission holds a public hearing, makes a recommendation, moves that up to the city council. They hold a public hearing and take a vote on it.
And a timeline on that?
That's now we're getting into the area of guesstimates. So I think the earliest that next step can be completed is probably sometime late summer into the fall, possibly even into the early winter. This is largely based on kind of budgetary and workload considerations at our end. So Dr. Allen's done his part, and now we've got to take these next steps, but it is going to take some time.
Who writes the next step?
That's a good question. I've been in heated negotiations with my boss over that, and we've not resolved that yet. So I'll keep you apprised of that, but that's been an ongoing discussion. There's some budgetary things going on. We're in the process of adopting a budget now, and just how that's going to be handled from a staffing point of view, I don't have a good answer for yet. I know what my preferences are, and that would be to hire somebody.
What about the biology piece of the discussion that hasn't been addressed?
Yeah, I was as Dr. Allen was talking about that, I was thinking about who those people might be. He identified some of the botanist sources. There's also people at ODFW who've weighed in on this peripherally in the past, but if we, the city, engage them more directly, I think we can get a more detailed and kind of focused response to this. So yeah, I think that's a part of the puzzle that's yet to be fitted in here.
That's another science part that has to be done then.
Yeah, well, I think there is, I don't think it's the study of this magnitude, but yeah, there is some more input, particularly in the area of kind of aquatic biology or marine biology and botany that we need some more information on, that you'll need more information on before you can make an informed decision. And that would be the intent, is to bring that to you before we ask you to vote on anything, obviously. But I think probably at the next round of public information that would come forth, I would hope. I don't have a clear path for the work program or how exactly that's going to work, but I'm kind of formulating in my mind who those people might be and how we approach them.
And Mark, will people be notified again for these future?
Yes.
Because and may I suggest that Lisa Frazier be included on that list? And also,
I'm about 100% positive she was included on the list.
I spoke to her and she wasn't on it. Also, Oregon State Parks.
Jay Senewald was notified of this.
So
I did notify Jay Senewald at State Parks.
I talked to Jay today.
I disconnect. Sir?
I'm a numbers freak. On page 68, I think that there's a number that got put in there wrong. For the potential range of the crest elevation.
Where on the page is it?
Page 68, first paragraph, section 539. It talks about 8.2 to 8.7 meters. That should equate to 27 to 30.3 feet, not 28.5.
Where is it on the page?
In the first paragraph, near the end of the paragraph.
Fourth line from the bottom.
Fourth line, yeah, fifth line from the bottom.
I must be looking at the wrong page. Tell me that again.
Page 68.
Oh, yeah. No one.
Not that it means it will be, but somebody may legally get in your face about it.
Sure.
Right, that's what they did, that's what they did. And then, just another question, how many cubic yards is in a typical dump truck?
10 for the small ones.
Okay, so if you've got 82,400 cubic yards, that's 8,240 dump trucks.
Right.
Okay.
It's a lot of time.
While you were looking, or you were talking about that, we looked at the mailing list, and we had Lisa Frazier's old address. That's why she didn't receive it. Jay, we emailed it directly to him, so I don't know why he didn't read it. I'll talk to him.
Okay. Thank you.
Sir?
Dr. Allen, thank you for your presentation. You really cleared up a lot of questions that we all had in the room. You did a great job. and to the planning commission, and some motion and all and certainly I have some action for tonight. Question for you, is it safe to assume, given the northward movement of sand that you're illustrating, that if there's a dune grading event south of, say, Breakers or south of Chapman Point, that it's going to, that sand from that event will move northward?
Possible.
I'm just, again, I'm not a geologist, but it seems commonsensically like it would shift.
Possible. Given the way the current patterns are operating, recognizing again, I mean, we're talking, if you move, 5,000 to 6,000 cubic yards, let's say down by Haystack Rock, again, that's a drop in the bucket with respect to how much sand may be moving in the intertidal zone anyway. So it's probably, in that example there, it's going to be a negligible, I would argue it's probably a negligible amount.
If it's a smaller.
If it's a small amount. It would be just absorbed by the system.
So, for about the last 20 years, we've been actually regrading residential, district, right? And we've been planting non-indigenous plants in there, which grows the dune larger. Has there been any studies, basically, how much sand has been moved from that area within the last 20 years to the Chapman Point area? I mean, it's kind of a follow-on to this.
Yeah. We couldn't differentiate the amount of sand that you might be supplying to north of Acolla Creek. I mean, you would have to do some pretty major sand tracing type studies to investigate that one. I mean,
I just know, basically how much has grown since 1971.
Sure.
I've been there, right? And we used to have 25 stairs going down to the beach, which is the top, tread of 6 inches. That's 150 inches, and that was at the end of the street.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's 150 feet out.
Sure.
Right? And I understand what you're saying about Chapman Point moving forward. I've seen the degradation of the houses falling off that. So I understand what's been happening down there. But I've also seen the north side really get kind of hammered by it all. And Chapman Point is obviously...
This is straying a little bit from you did ask a question at the beginning, but this sort of straying.
Sorry, that was a question, okay. I'm just observation, okay.
Yeah. Mr. Patrick?
Let me just also add one other thing is I can give an example where we know a situation where 150 feet of dune can disappear in a couple of winter seasons. And so it's a very...
I've seen lots of variations.
And the case in point is Nesquin. I mean, in 1996, Nesquin was battling exactly the same problem that you're experiencing at Presidential and Chapman Point. They had 150 feet of dune in front of them, and sand was actively blowing in amongst the homes there. That's at the south end of that cell. That dune sand is gone. There's now a riprap wall along the entire community of Nesquin in the space of really probably about a decade. So things can change very, very dramatically. And again, it goes back to my cautious approach, which is that adaptive management, where you need to be monitoring and tracking things closely in order to be able to protect what's there.
As an observation, though, I'm just saying that since the regrades have been going on, in that presidential, the dunes have not been retracting at all. They've been just growing.
Sure. Well, and I've already shown, I pointed that out.
I did notice that in there.
Right.
And it seems like it's accumulating in that area. And I was just asking.
Yeah, so going back to volumes, it's accumulated, but since 1997, it's accumulated 22,000 cubic yards, compared with 200,000.
A lot. Yeah.
At Chapman Point. So there's a big difference there. It is gaining sand. It has been prograding. The one comment, and I had a slide up earlier with respect to perhaps, again, going back to my concept of building a lower, lighter dune. I think what you have going at Presidential is kind of conceptually the idea is of where you could go with a similar approach at Chapman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Quick question, when you look back in history, before the grass was introduced, and and the difference in the accretion, when it didn't have the grass, did it go north and south more more normally, or did it?
As far as we know, I mean, you know, you can go up and down the Oregon coast, and you'll find there are spit complexes that point south, which indicate southward transport. There are other spits that are pointing north, which indicate northward transport. So you can find these alternating patterns up and down the coast. The argument for a general balance of sediment transport is that over the long term, we haven't seen any one particular end of that system actively aggrading and building up. In other words, we're not seeing sand leaking around from one subcell and supplying the adjacent cell next to it, and progradation going on there. We don't see any evidence of anything like that. We see this seesaw pattern of sediment movement within each of these cells there, responding to these decadal shifts effectively in predominant patterns of waves and winds.
And does that cell start at like short sands and then goes north because of the economy? Because the Halen's a whole
right. So, actually, I've never been into short sand, which I regret. Oswald, yes.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, I know. I've heard so much about it. I conveniently cut it off at Falcon Cove. I suspect that that's enough of a barrier for short sand. I think it's a reasonable place to
make that
division.
Delineation.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Just wondering. Yeah. Interesting, how it all does.
I mean, certainly,
as
you drive around near County there, I mean, you can see it extends out a long way into deep water there.
Yes, it does.
And by that virtue, we've also seen a lot of accumulation of sand up by Manzanita. That's coming and going a lot right now. We don't know definitively that sand doesn't leak around the ends there. It's just physically there's nothing to suggest that it is. We would see active accretion in Falcon Cove to suggest that sand would be coming around.
Okay.
And there's just no evidence. I mean, in fact, it's counter that.
Now on the north side though, is Akola and Indian Beach, is that affected by our cell?
I'm sorry. So Akola would be still part
Because
of.
there's Chapman Point and then
I did not.
Tillamook.
Right. Tillamook is the northern barrier, so there would be sand transport going into Akola.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I wasn't here 35 years ago when one of the owners at Breakers Point said, in 3 days' time, thousands of yards came in. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. He says, no. And I said, well, there wasn't any dune grass then. He said, no damn dune grass. And my question is, if there were no dune grass, does that sand perhaps cycle back out into the little cell? What's the wave activity? Maybe I missed that in your presentation, but does wave activity take it south underneath the water in the littoral cell, and we've now managed to trap the sand on the shore instead of letting it?
Right. So the sand is actually being transported in one of two mechanisms. One is through wind transport, which obviously is moving material from the intertidal zone to the back of the beach into the dunes. The other part of it is the littoral transport, which takes place effectively seaward of the breaker line. And it's a function of the orientation in which the waves are arriving along the shore relative to the shoreline. So whenever if you have waves arriving, if waves are arriving shore normal, so straight on, then you're going to see what we call south circulation starting to develop, and that's where you start to see rip currents. Sand is moving in both directions, and they may be distributed out offshore the breaker line through these rip currents, and then re-entrained by waves and move back onto the beach that way. If the waves are arriving from a predominantly oblique angle, be it from the southwest or northwest, it sets up a longshore directed current within that breaker zone that's able to entrain sand and mobilize it along through the water column along the beach there.
Meaning laterally.
Laterally.
And that's the question I'm having is, I find it very fascinating that we're losing sand in the south and gaining it on the north. And I'm saying, is it possible that we have now interrupted that cycle in such a way that it
Well,
wouldn't happen?
so interrupted in the sense that sand is being stabilized at the north end there.
Yeah,
That in due course, in time, will eventually be re-entrained by a big storm. I mean, we will experience storms that are comparable to what we experienced in the late 90s and even more extreme storms in the past. That will absolutely hammer that dune system and re-entrain, erode and re-entrain that sand and take it back offshore. And
even though this dune grass is so effective at holding it.
oh, that dune grass is not effective.
No, that's what I thought, yeah. That's what I thought.
Not against these bugs. There's a case in point. I showed there was a picture of actually me clambering down a dune up in the Clatsop Plains here in a small storm we had last winter, and that's an area that huge dunes, 60-meter high dunes that will almost have near vertical faces cut into them from a recent storm. Yeah. It's all a function of where those storms, where they track and how they, where they cross the coast and things like that.
Really appreciate your time, thank you.